So here we are continuing on with our factor markets. We're going to look a little bit more closely at the market for labor in this section, and we're going to talk about some of the things that would affect the supply and the demand curves for labor. And we're going to talk about the wage rate and how we can also graph a lot of these things, what these graphs would look like. And also something called monopsony is what we're going to talk about here. So let's dive in. And first talk about the supply of labor. We talked about the demand for labor previously. We talked about how the demand for labor slopes downward. It has an inverse relationship because if wages are high, then or the price of labor is high, then people that are buying labor, firms that are purchasing labor, are going to want to purchase less of it. But if wages go down, they will want to purchase more. So that's a downward sloping demand curve for labor. The supply of labor is going to shift upward, just like the supply curve in the product market. It's going to shift upward for the same reason that the supply curve shifts upward in the product market. As wages go up, we want to supply more labor. If wages are down, we don't want to supply as much of our labor. It would not be worth that trade-off to us of leisure time or whatever the case may be, but if wages go up, more labor is going to be supplied. Now, as far as the supply and demand curves for labor, we're going to talk about a few things here that would shift the supply of labor. We talked about things that would shift the demand for labor in a previous module, with the demand for the product changing, the price of the product, technology, and all of that. Here we're talking about supply of labor, keeping in mind that a change in the wage rate would only cause movement along that labor supply curve, the same way that a change in price only causes movement along the supply curve or movement along the demand curve. So again, if wages go up, yes, that would incentivize more people to supply their labor, but they're just moving to a new spot on the already given supply curve. It's not shifting it either to the left or to the right. So let's talk about a couple of things that would then shift the demand for labor either to the left or the right. Shifts would occur due, one, to changes in preferences, perhaps. If a type of work is being preferred, but also changes in preferences as far as who is working. A good example of this would be, say, during and after World War II. During and after World War II, more women entered the workforce. There was more of a preference by women to enter the workforce, and so that would have shifted the shifted the supply curve for labor to the right, because you would have had more of supply of labor as women started entering the workforce more. The changes in population can shift the supply of labor. We've seen that before. We've talked about that one actually, changes in population, how that can affect the product market, but it can also affect, of course, the factor market here. If there's an increase in population, that's going to increase the supply of labor, thus shifting that labor supply curve to the right. If there's a decrease in population, there would be a decrease in the supply of labor, thus shifting that labor supply curve to the left. Changes in opportunities. This has to do with, shifting technology and trends and all that kind of stuff. For example, 50 years ago, there weren't that many opportunities for workers in computers or people who had computer skills or computer programming or software or anything like that. The opportunities for that are significantly increased. Thus, there are more people supplying their labor in that particular capacity. So that would have increased the supply of labor for workers with computer skills or workers in the computer market of some type. On the other hand, let's say people that produce horses and buggies. Well, the opportunity for that is kind of no longer there anymore, so that would have decreased the supply of those workers. So sometimes it has to do with opportunities in particular fields as they come and go, as times change and as technology changes and fads change and all that kind of stuff. Changes in wealth. And here we need to distinguish wealth from, riches, wealth from income. Wealth is not just the value of a person's income, but a value of their overall assets, whether that's real estate, stocks and bonds, different things like that. When people have more wealth, they are less inclined to then want to work. So that actually shifts the supply of labor to the left. When wealth is decreased, let's say the stock market is not doing as well, the real estate market is not doing as well, that would decrease a person's wealth, thus incentivizing them to work more. So that would actually increase the supply of labor. More people would be willing to supply their labor in that particular case. But mostly what you're going to see when looking at the labor market, the big thing we want to accomplish here is talking about the graphing situation, some of the different things that we can discern from these graphs, and how we would actually show some of these things on these graphs. And we're going to do some examples with all of this stuff later. So we talked about our demand for labor and how that is represented by that marginal revenue product. It's downward sloping, as I was just talking about. Again, if the wage rate is higher, then the buyers of labor, which is our firms, are going to want to buy less. So we see a lower quantity. As the wage goes down, though, the quantity demanded is going to go up, because as wages are lower, then employers are going to want to use more labor. They will buy more of it. Here's our supply curve for labor, okay? And that is represented by the marginal factor cost, or the marginal resource cost, the cost of hiring that additional unit of labor. Which that's going to be right here, okay? So equilibrium then is where the two things meet, and the equilibrium is the place, that's going to be our wage rate. That is what's going to determine what the wage is going to be in this particular market. So if this were the market for, pizzeria workers, where the supply for that labor and the demand for that labor meet right here at equilibrium, that is our wage rate. That is going to be the wage that the market sets for pizzeria workers. This is going to be our equilibrium employment number. That's the equilibrium quantity of workers that are going to be employed in this market. So again, this demand curve is represented by the marginal revenue product, and the supply curve is represented by the marginal factor cost or marginal resource cost. That is the cost of hiring an additional worker. Okay. Now, some other things that we're going to So here we have our part of the side-by-side graphs for a perfectly competitive labor market and a perfectly competitive firm. This one has it kind of flipped, though, from the way you would normally do it. I don't know why it's like that, and I really ought to replace this with a better one. But over here on the left side, this is our perfectly competitive labor market. Okay, we have an upward sloping market labor supply curve. That is our marginal resource cost or marginal factor cost. We have a downward sloping demand curve for labor. That is our marginal revenue product, okay? And then equilibrium, that's going to be the wage rate in this particular market, and there's our equilibrium quantity of workers that would be demanded or needed in this particular market, okay? Then what we would do for our firm, if this is our firm over here, we're going to take this equilibrium wage and pull it over and make a perfectly elastic supply curve. If you recall, in perfectly competitive product markets, we had supply and demand that then met at an equilibrium that created an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity for the market. Then we took that price and we pulled it over to the firm, and it made a perfectly elastic demand curve. Remember that whole Mr. Dart thing? That's kind of what this does. But instead of pulling over that perfectly elastic demand curve, that's supply. That is now going to be supply when we're talking about the labor market. So that's what we have down here. Now, if I were to complete this, what I would do, this was my firm. Okay, so assume that this is my firm. Isn't that lovely? Okay, firm. Ugh, yeah. Okay, then I would have a downward sloping demand curve. That's my marginal revenue product. This would be the firm's equilibrium, so right in there, and that would be their quantity, and of course their wage takers. Okay, so they have to take the wage that is set by the particular market. Let's take a look at the exception to that. So what I was just showing you was a perfectly competitive labor market, a firm that hires labor in a perfectly competitive market. And we're going to see more examples of that in just a second. So if that didn't make sense, I'm going to come back to it in some practical examples here in a moment. But I want to talk for a minute about the one exception to that, or the situation where a firm would not be hiring labor in a perfectly competitive market. They'd be hiring in an imperfectly competitive market. And this is one of those theoretical fictions. It probably doesn't have a whole lot of specific application in the real world, but this is an important concept that has occasionally popped up on the AP exam. When it does, it's usually just one or two questions, but it is something that needs to be learned. And this is something called monopsony. And when you first hear and see that, you're probably thinking, well, somebody doesn't know how to hear or pronounce or or spell monopoly. But monopsony is a separate thing, but it does have some similarities to monopoly, and you actually apply some of the same skills that you learn with monopoly to a monopsony. What a monopsony means is when there is one single buyer of a particular factor, one single buyer of labor. So again, this is not a real realistic situation in a practical, real life kind of a sense. Again, it's kind of it's a model for understanding things. But this would be like, say you had a town that had one employer only. Maybe there's one factory that employs people, but there's no other business, there's no other place for people to work. Again, not incredibly likely, because even if there is just one factory in the town, there's probably a grocery store and, you know, a school or something like that. So throw all that aside, that sometimes things don't quite make sense. And assume that you have a, one, let's say, call it a factory, that is the only employer in the town. So they are the only buyer of labor. They are the only people supplying those jobs. They're the only buyer of labor. So just like a monopoly is when you have one firm that makes a particular product, or one firm that sells a product, this is a situation where we have one firm that buys labor, okay? And what that means is that the market is not perfectly competitive, and this means that to hire more workers, the firm has to increase the wage rate, meaning that the firm has higher costs, okay? So this is just like how in monopolies we talked about how in order to sell an additional product, they would have to lower the price. So at, this price at $5, people are willing to buy 10 of their particular thing, but if they want to sell the 11th one, they've got to lower the price maybe to $4 or something like that. The same thing is true for monopsony. What you're assuming here is that the monopsonistic firm is already employing all of the workers who are willing and able to work at that particular wage. They've already employing all of them. So if they want to hire another person, they're going to have to raise the wage rate. They will have to raise it, and not just for that person, but for all of the workers. So just like how in a monopoly they have to lower the price to sell an additional good, in a monopsony they've got to raise the wage rate in order to hire an additional worker, but that increases their overall costs. So what this table shows you is some of the figures for that. So let's say at the first worker, okay, $6. All right, so there's their total cost of labor at $6. At the second worker, though, so we assume that at that one worker, that's all they can hire. There's nobody else that's willing or able to work at that wage. So if they want to hire a second worker, they're going to have to increase the wage to $7. If they want to hire a third one, they've got to increase it to $8. Fourth worker, they got to increase it to $9, so forth and so on. So you see that at each adding each additional worker increased their cost, but it doesn't increase it by the same amount. Let's come over here to marginal factor cost. If this was a perfectly competitive market, the marginal factor cost would be the same for every worker. They'd be paying, another $10 for a worker, another $20, or whatever the marginal factor cost is. But in this case, it's not the same thing, because let's say our total cost of labor at one worker is $6, okay? So from 0 to 6, the marginal factor cost is $6. Well, now at the second worker, now it's 14, because I've got the wage times the quantity of labor, okay, 14. So now my marginal factor cost is 8. Then it goes to 10, so forth. What you should be seeing, this is almost the exact same pattern, it's just reversed, of how the total cost and the marginal cost, in a monopoly, how that marginal cost was not the same thing as the price. That's the exact same thing here. The price and the marginal factor, the price of the labor, the wage rate, and the marginal factor cost is not the same thing, because again, they're having to raise the wage every time they hire another person, and that increased their costs. So what that means when you graph this, just like when you graphed a monopoly, how you had a downward sloping demand curve and then a marginal revenue curve that sat just beneath it like this, the same thing happens for a monopsony, except that you're talking about supply, and it kind of goes off in a bit of a different direction. I'll show you this up there in just a minute as well. So what you have is a marginal resource cost or marginal factor cost curve that slopes upward, and then above that, let me correct what I just said. You have your supply curve for labor that slopes upward, and then a separate marginal resource cost or marginal factor cost curve that sits above it, like that. Okay, so there's our monopoly with downward sloping demand curve with a marginal revenue curve that sits beneath it. For monopsony, notice it's kind of almost like you turned it upside down. So just like in monopoly, how demand and marginal revenue are not the same, in a monopsony, supply and marginal resource cost or marginal factor cost are not the same. Okay, so let me show you that again. And again, so there we are, like I was just showing you. So what we have here, let me get my pointer going. There's our supply curve, upward sloping, okay? Now, if this were a perfectly competitive market, that would be the same thing as the marginal factor cost of the marginal resource cost. But in monopsony, it's not. It's going to start close to the same place. It's going to sit above it and kind of go off in this direction. So again, if you kind of flipped it over or turned your head over, it looks like the demand and the marginal revenue curve for monopoly, but here we're talking about supply and marginal resource cost or marginal factor cost, okay? Now, so as far as how do we use this to find certain information, because what you'll need to know from this, just like with monopolies, how you've needed to be able to look at that and say, okay, what is the quantity that they're going to produce, what is the quantity they're going to produce, what is their cost, and what are they actually going to charge? You got to be able to do the same thing here, and again, it is almost the exact same thing, it's just kind of flipped, okay? You just sort of have to flip it around. So now what we have here on this graph, we have the same thing that we had over here. So we still have our market supply curve for labor, and there's our marginal factor cost. Now what we've added in is that downward sloping demand curve, okay? So where that supply equals demand, right there, there's our equilibrium employment level, okay? Now, you may recall that in monopoly, you know, we went up to where the demand was, what people were willing to pay to find the price. This is very, very similar, except, like I said, kind of backwards. I know I keep saying that. So there's our equilibrium employment, all right? Now here's where our marginal resource cost equals our marginal revenue product, okay? There's that spot, but that's not what the employer is going to pay for labor. They're going to pay this, okay? They're going to pay what's being supplied by the market, okay? This isn't being supplied right here, but this is. So this is your actual equilibrium. So instead of going from the top up, it goes from the bottom down, if that makes any kind of sense. So again, this is the equilibrium, but right down here, that's the wage rate in a monopsony. Oh, look, a friend. Can you say hi? And you also might be asked to compare this to what the situation would be if this were a perfectly competitive labor market. So if this were a perfectly competitive labor market, then your marginal factor cost would be the same as this. That would all be the same. So, let's switch colors here. This would be your equilibrium point if this were a perfectly competitive labor market. So your quantity, your equilibrium employment quantity would be right there, and then the wage would be right here. So, as you can see, if this were a perfectly competitive labor situation, the wage would be higher and the number of workers that would be hired would be greater as well. So a monopsony pays less and hires less, just like a monopoly produces less and charges more. You get a similar situation when it comes to monopsony. All right, so let's take a look at a couple of practical examples, and I think this will help hopefully clear up some things that may have been confusing earlier. Econ, like a lot of it, you know, you just kind of have to do it or see it done. It makes more sense that way. So if you're confused, hopefully this will clear up some things. So this particular question, and I go ahead and apologize in advance for how funky and, you know, first grade like these graphs are going to look, because it is hard to draw these with a mouse and with my right hand, but I'll do the best that I can. So first part of this says, using correctly labeled side-by-side graphs show each of the following: the equilibrium wage rate in the market, the labor supply curve that the firm faces, and the demand curve the firm faces, and the number of workers the firm hires. So this is the side-by-side graph situation I was talking about earlier, but the one that I had actually had it a little bit, it had it backwards. Let's take a look at what this would look like. So I'm going to draw two side-by-side graphs. This one is going to be my market. This one is going to be the firm, okay? Just like in perfect competition, our market looked something like that. So this was our supply of labor. That is equal to the marginal factor cost. And then this, of course, is the demand for labor, which is the marginal revenue product. Okay, all right. So there's the equilibrium. Here's how we find the equilibrium wage in the market. This would be our wage rate right here. And this would be our equilibrium quantity. Right there, I should label my axes. Shame on me for not doing that earlier. Wage, quantity, quantity. All right, now. Okay, so there's what we have in the market. So what we're going to do now for the firm is we are going to take this wage rate, just like we did in perfectly competitive product markets. We're going to pull that straight across, and I'm going to have a perfectly elastic curve here, but instead of this being demand, this is going to be supply. This is my marginal factor cost for the firm. Okay, then I'm going to have a downward sloping demand curve for the firm. And again, that's represented by the marginal revenue product. Okay, so let's go back to the question. Here's my equilibrium wage rate in the market. Here's the labor supply curve. Let me get my pointer out here so you can see the things. So there's my equilibrium wage rate in the market. Here is my supply curve that the firm faces. Now the number of workers that the firm hires, that's going to be where their marginal factor cost equals their marginal resource cost. So there's the quantity that the firm would hire. Okay, so they're going to pay the wage that the market sets, which again we can see right here, and there's the quantity that they are going to hire. Okay, how did you determine the number of workers the firm hires? Here in the orange, well, that is where the marginal resource cost equals the marginal revenue product, or the marginal factor cost equals the marginal revenue product, right there. Okay, now how does an increase in productivity across the market affect the wage rate paid by the firm? All right. So there's an increase in productivity. Now what that means is workers are more productive. That means they are able to produce more product. So maybe now instead of producing 5 units of a good in an hour, now I can produce 10. So if my marginal product is increasing, then my marginal revenue product is increasing. So what's going to happen is the marginal revenue product, remember that's the demand curve for labor, that is going to shift to the right. I'm going to have a new demand curve for labor. Perhaps I want to label that D2. That's a horrible looking 2, but you see my point. So what just happened to our wage rate in the market? Well, it went up. Wages went up. And the quantity went up as well. So there's my new quantity down here. All right, so now I'm going to take so now I've shown what that does in the market. Let's see what it does in the firm. So now I'm going to pull this new wage rate straight across. I have a new, shouldn't have that hump in it, new curve here for labor, for the supply of labor. So you can see what that did is that the wage rate went up, but the quantity of workers hired now went down. At a higher wage, the firm is not going to hire as many people. They're not going to be able to pay for that many workers, okay? So that's what happened to the wage rate paid by the firm went up. The quantity that they are actually going to hire went down, okay? Now, the last part of this says, how will an increase in productivity in only the firm affect the number of workers hired? So what we need to do there, let's assume, again, that this increase in productivity, I shouldn't have erased all of that, was just in this particular firm. So let me go back, and let's go back to our original demand curve our original supply curve that we had right there. Let me get rid of this. Okay. All right, so there's my demand curve again. Here's where we were. If that increase in productivity only affected this firm, okay, so only their demand for labor moved, the market did not, which means the supply didn't move. So what that means is that their wage rate does not change, okay, so only their quantity of workers demanded would change, but the wage rate is actually the same. Their quantity is higher than it was here at this particular point, but the wage rate is the same. So if it only affects that particular firm, then it does not actually affect the wage rate, okay? All right, so hopefully that clears up the side-by-side thing. So here's our market, here's our firm, and then we just manipulate the curves from there to see what happens to the wage rate and the quantity and all things like that. Okay, so let's take a look at a monopsony question. So this graph here, again, this shows us a monopsony. So let's point out a few things and let's label a couple of things before we start taking a look at this question. So here we have our downward sloping demand curve, which is represented by our marginal revenue product. Then we have this right here, which is our supply of labor, but we have a separate marginal resource cost or marginal factor cost curve right there. All right, so make sure we know what that is. So the first part of this says explain why the MRC is set above the labor supply curve. Remember, that is because the firm has got to increase the wage rate every time they hire a new worker, okay? And so their marginal resource costs increase their costs as they go up. So their costs are increasing in a different way than the supply curve is moving on up. So it's just like this. The same reason why the demand curve and the marginal revenue curve are not the same thing in monopoly. That's what we're seeing here. It's just sort of flipped over a little bit. What equality will be used to determine the number of workers hired? Well, that is still going to be where the MRC, or marginal factor cost, MFC, equals the marginal revenue product. Okay. Now we're going to use the labels on the graph to find the number of workers that would be hired, the wage rate of the workers, the number of workers that would be hired if this were perfect competition, and the wage rate if this were a perfectly competitive labor market. Okay, so let's begin with find the number of workers to be hired. Well, that's going to be where MRC equals MFP. Okay, I'm sorry, I said that totally wrong. Where MRC equals MRP, that's where that is. Okay, so if we come down, that's the quantity. All right, so this would be our quantity, letter A. That is the number of workers that are going to be hired, okay? Now the wage, they are not going to pay this wage right here. They're going to pay this right here. So the wage rate is going to be that letter C. That's the wage that they're going to pay. If this were perfect competition, then this MRC curve would be the same as this supply curve right here. We just have one. So this would be your equilibrium point if this were a perfectly competitive labor market. All right, that would be right there. So then our quantity hired would be B, and the wage rate would be D. Okay, so the last part of this, what is the comparison of the number of workers hired and their wage rate between perfectly and imperfectly competitive labor markets? Well, perfectly competitive labor market, overall, we would have a higher wage. D is higher than C, and we would hire more workers because B is more than A. So again, this was I was saying a slide or two ago, overall, the wage is lower and the number of workers that are hired is lower in a monopsony, or an imperfectly competitive labor market, rather than a perfectly competitive one. Okay, let's look at one more example here. So this one says that Lead Belly Company sells pencils in a perfectly competitive product market, and it hires workers in a perfectly competitive labor market. We assume that the wage for workers is $150 a day. That's going to be important here in a second. First of all, what rule should Lead Belly follow to hire the profit maximizing amount of labor? Well, that is going to be where the marginal resource cost, or marginal factor cost, equals the marginal revenue product of labor. Okay, so MRC equals MRP, or MFC equals MRP, whichever way you're doing that. Okay, at the profit maximizing level of output, the marginal product of the last worker hired is 30 boxes of pencils per day. Calculate the price of a box of pencils. Okay, well, to do that, we're going to use that same formula that we've got right there. Okay, so MRC equals MRP. Well, our marginal resource cost, we know that if we look at the very beginning of this problem, is $150, because it costs us $150 to hire an additional worker. Okay, all right. Now the marginal resource cost, okay, it has to equal the marginal revenue product in order, in this perfectly competitive market. Those two things have got to be equal. That marginal revenue product is the additional revenue that they gain for every one that they sell. That's the price, okay, and that's what we're looking for. So that's the unknown, X, okay, times, and we know that the marginal revenue product is the marginal product times the price, okay. We want to know what the price is. We have right here that the marginal product of the last worker hired was 30, so we are looking, then we've solved for X here, so X equals 5. Because 5 times 30 would be 150. So the price of a box of pencils must be $5. So that's how we could use that formula to solve that little equation there. All right, now it says draw a diagram of the labor market for pencil workers next to the diagram of the labor supply and demand for this particular firm. Okay, so let's do like we did a couple of slides ago. I've got my market, I have my firm, I'm going to label my axis axes there. There's the wage, there's the quantity. All right, here's our firm. We have an upward sloping supply for labor. Remember, that represents the marginal factor cost. We have a downward sloping demand for labor. That is the marginal revenue product, okay? Let's see, and this would be our quantity in the market, and here is our wage rate that is set by the market, okay? Let's see, what else does it say to do? Okay, and we're gonna pull this wage rate over. Perfectly elastic for this particular firm, and remember, this represents supply. The firm faces a downward sloping demand curve, so where supply equals demand, that's going to be the quantity of workers this firm hires, and of course that is the wage rate. Okay, now it says, suppose some pencil workers switch jobs to the computer industry on side-by-side graphs from Part C, so what we got right here. Show how this change affects the equilibrium wage and quantity of labor for both the pencil market and for this particular firm. How does it affect the marginal product of labor? Okay, so people have left this job. This is a change in opportunities. People have left this industry for the computer industry. That means that the supply of workers in this particular industry has decreased. So our supply curve is going to shift over to the left. Here's supply 2. All right, so the wage rate actually goes up. All right. So there's a new wage rate. Here's a new quantity. So they want less workers in this market. There's quantity 2. Here is wage 2. So wages went up, but the quantity that this market would need is demanding has gone down. Now we're going to pull this new wage rate over, make a new perfectly elastic supply curve. Okay, so now here is the new equilibrium for this particular firm. Again, they want less workers, so the quantity went down, but the wage went up. Okay, so now we have shown the change in the equilibrium wage and the quantity of labor for both the market and for the firm. And now, how does this affect the marginal product of labor for Leadbelly? Okay, well, to do that, this is our marginal product, or I should say marginal revenue product. This is that right there, and you'll notice that they were at this point, marginal revenue product was right there before, now it's up here, so it's higher. It has increased it. So the answer to that would be it has increased the marginal revenue product for labor.